Hi, everybody. What I want to talk about today is a situation that comes up far too often. It's a situation where a person interviews, finds a new job, they get the job, they start, and within X number of weeks or months, they realize they made a huge mistake. They join a place that the culture's bad, or it's toxic, or the job has changed since what they were hired for, or things have just gone wrong, and they're like, I've got to get out of here. I can't stay here. It happens far too often. And what I'll tell you is not all the time, but a lot of the time it's preventable. And I want to go over this now because hiring is picking up again and people are moving around, changing jobs. And I want to make sure you don't make this mistake. Because what I'll tell you is when I talk to a lot of folks in this situation, more times than not, they will say there were red flags. I saw some signs, but I chose to ignore them. And so what I want to talk about is things you might observe, but then also how do you mitigate the risk that this doesn't happen to you? You can't mitigate all the risk, understood, but a lot of the ones you can. How can you recognize those red flags early on such that you don't join? Or how you can learn enough stuff to either validate or dispute or refute the red flag you saw. So let's start with things you can observe. So number one is if you're interviewing for especially a senior enablement role, you want to see who is or is not part of your interview process. So if your CRO is absent and you're running enablement, that to me is a pretty big red flag, right? Even if you don't report up to that person directly, if you're, say, as an example, you report up to the VP of Ops who reports up to the CRO, you would think the CRO would have a very large stake in who gets hired for the head of enablement role. And so if they are not part of this conversation, that would qualify as a red flag. And so keep them. And then also, like as part of the interview process, I've heard people who go through the entire process to go for the head of enablement role, but nobody in the enablement team gets to interview them. They kept them sequestered. Maybe that's a yellow flag, but I would want to know, why have I not been able to talk to the team? I would love to meet them and get to know what they think and see what they're looking for in the leader. 1,000 things. And so I would start to look at your interview process they've set out for you and just look critically and see who is and who is not part of this. And whoever the executive sponsor of enablement is ought to be a very big presence throughout the entire process. And so related to that, I think, for that revenue leader and the executive sponsor, what is the quantity and quality of their engagement in the interview process? Are they on their phones the whole time, or are they engaged? Are they asking very trite questions that were given by HR, or are they asking smart, insightful questions that challenge you and assess how good you are? And if their questions are removed or not quite in tune, that is something to take note of. It might tell you how well they understand your function. So also, if you have, this is an interesting one, if you have a good cross section of people in the interview, so a sales leader, maybe some sales managers, maybe even a couple of reps, what is their interaction amongst them? Do the people feel comfortable around the revenue leader, or are they toxically deferential? Do they listen to what they have to say, or are they just nodding their heads and when that person speaks no one else speaks? Or is there a friendly banter or disagreement, or is it conversant? Those can start to give you signs of how the dynamic on the team is with that leader. If no one feels comfortable enough to speak up, that tells you something. If it's very egalitarian, everyone speaks up and everyone laughs and makes fun of each other, and that might tell you about the dynamic and the culture within the sales team. Like I love when people are okay with their direct reports disagreeing with them and challenging them. That's a healthy environment. And when you see the opposite of that could be a cause for concern. I would also just, as part of the things you can observe in the interview process, is how do people talk about the company and each other and the enablement organization? Are they the kind of people who talk trash, and not in a fun, jokey sort of way, but in a I'm going to knock them down sort of way? Or are they the ones who speak highly of others and talk positively about the organization, not in a Pollyanna sort of I'm going to sell the company to you way, but more in just like they talk highly of their peers, they talk respectfully about their peers. And those little things of, it's fun when people talk trash and they can say, yeah, enablement leaders, they are terrible, and why don't you come in here and fix it? Like, that's not the best. And so I would look for culturally how they show up, and are they negative or are they positive? So those are just little subtle things you can just observe throughout your process. But on things where you're more proactive, there are questions you can ask, things you can probe that will also give you a good indication. And one of the things I focus on the most is this idea of executive sponsorship, that every enablement organization should have an executive sponsor, oftentimes a CRO, but not necessarily. And it's very important that you gauge their ability and willingness to be an executive sponsor. And so easy to do when you're on the inside, hard from the outside. So I think there are questions you can ask. And so if you realize the CRO is there and he or she is the executive sponsor of enablement, there are questions you can ask. One of my favorite ones is, all right, Ms. CRO, what was the last big sales enablement initiative that you did here? And she might say, we rolled out a new methodology. She might say, we rolled out a big discovery skills training because we weren't good enough at it, whatever it is. And then your follow-up question is, cool, what was your personal involvement in that initiative? What was your personal involvement in that initiative? What you're trying to understand and distinguish between is, are they the kind of executive sponsor who is a sponsor in name only? Like, I wrote the check to buy the trainer who came in to do the discovery skills, or I signed off spending $500,000 for this new methodology. Good, that's fine. But what you're really listening for is their personal involvement. That they were the ones who cracked the whip to tell the team to get it done. They're the ones who showed up at every single session on the new methodology to show to the team that it's important. That they said, if it's important enough for me and my time, it's important enough for you and your time. Or if there was a messaging certification where everybody had to record their new pitch, that they went first. And so listening for where they put the weight of their role behind enablement initiatives. As a side note, one of my friends was interviewing a while ago, and the CRO asked her, the aspiring head of enablement, what would you do if you were rolling out a big initiative and the adoption was low? What would you do about that? And within that seemingly innocuous question, there was a tell. There was the fundamental belief that the CRO thought that it was enablement's job to be the enforcer, the one to crack the whip on everybody. And my response to that person, that CRO, would have been, actually, Ms. CRO, as the head of the sales organization, what would you do about that if your team wasn't following through on a big enablement initiative? Because in my mind, they should be the ones who said, hey, everybody, get it done by Friday or you're fired. Like, they're really emphatically behind it. And those who just say, you're the guy who has to go crack the whip and start to annoy people about getting it done, I think they don't understand the value of their role as sponsors and what the value of your role is as enablers. And so I think there are tells like that. But the more you understand how they get involved, how they show up as an executive sponsor, that's a big deal. And see where their sponsorship has made a very big difference or not. And so I think in those examples, you can start to really get a sense of, this person would have my back. This person knows how to get the most out of the organization. I think you can also ask questions about the kinds of programs that enablement takes on. Are they really important and really strategic? Or are they more tactical, small things, getting the house in order, stuff. And again, yeah, there's no right or wrong, but you'll get a sense of which ones align more with your interest, your experience, and asking them questions about what they typically have focused on is a good way to uncover how strategic they view the function or not. And I think you also can start to listen for and ask questions about the C-suite. And one of the biggest things I've heard from people in situations that don't pan out well is the C-suite dysfunction, that my CMO and CRO do not get along at all. This is a real example I heard probably 2 years ago. A head of enablement was hired, and on her, I want to say second or third day, she was having a one-on-one with her boss, the CRO, and the CRO told her, oh, by the way, the CMO and I do not get along, so you're not allowed to talk to anybody in marketing ever. Which is a shocking statement to hear on your second or third day, that you can't talk to the folks who, in theory, supply a lot of content for you and they are your partners in your job. And so that didn't pan out well. And so any questions you can get a sense of how the C-suite works together, examples of how they really work together, that can go a long way just to uncover issues. Now, what I'll tell you is if there is toxicity in the C-suite, there's nothing you can do about it. And either it works itself out or it doesn't. And that can be painful if it takes a long time. And so anything you can uncover in terms of how well that group works together will serve you well. And those are things you can ask in the interview. But I think also there is behind the scenes work that you not only can do, should do. I think first and foremost, you want to back channel your hiring manager. And so for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with this concept of back channeling, it's when you say, all right, my potential boss, her name is Megan. I want to go find out what I can on how it is to work for Megan. So maybe I go to LinkedIn and look for people who I know who have worked with her and ideally for her in her past, and find them and reach out to them on LinkedIn and say, hey, you don't know me, but, and say, hey, I'd love to pick your brain. Or ideally somebody you do know who you could say, hey, I'd love to ask you in confidence, like, what was she as a hiring manager? How well did she do with the enablement function? How often did you get to meet with her? Just things that might give you a better sense of how they are as a manager. I've had people whose managers have met with them once, first week, and then never again. And that is an awful, awful manager to have. And so the more you can assess how they are as a manager, how they work with you, how much they understand enablement, how they know how to get the most out of it or not, those are all very good things you can learn through back channeling. I think also you can talk to other folks in the organization. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's the sales team, but other folks who work with enablement and talk to them about their experience. How easy is enablement to work with? What's the reputation of enablement? Those might be very telling conversations. And I will also tell you, sometimes when you're interviewing, here's the 5, 6, 7 folks you're going to talk to. And I've had some of my best candidates say, actually, I would also like to talk to somebody else. And so if you can go in there and say, hey, I would love to talk to 2 folks in marketing, or maybe somebody in ops or whatever it is, who are not on your list of people they've given you, that's a smart thing to do. And so if you have questions, you want to get them answered. And so the more you can add to your interview list, the better. And these can be more informal. And if they say no, that surely is a red flag. But asking to talk to a high-ranking sales rep and a low-ranking sales rep and maybe somebody in marketing, or maybe get a demo, those are small asks that you can ask that, again, might give you some more intel that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's a very good thing. And the last thing I would add is there is Glassdoor and other things that are similar. They can be helpful, but take it with a grain of salt. Like, what you're looking for are patterns. If all these folks say CRO is out to lunch and they're awful and they're toxic and they expect you to work 24/7, and everyone's saying that, odds are that's true. If one person is saying it, take it with a grain of salt. That may not be true. And also, I would say another grain of salt to take is that information dated? So companies evolve, and sometimes they evolve fast with leadership changes. And so if all these comments, good or bad, are from 2 years ago, grain of salt. What's happening more currently? What are people posting now? And so those tools are good, but you want to make sure that you're not basing an opinion on 1-2 data points. You want to look for bigger patterns. So I think these are all important things you want to think about as you're navigating job changes over these years, and make sure you're not one of those folks who takes a new job and regrets it after 3-4 weeks.